Welcome to Thursday afternoon's the impact of COVID on the property market panel session. We are lucky enough to be joined today by Michael Shapiro, who is the property partner, head of the property team at Shemmings. We have Andy Noton, who is partner at Lubbock Fine Chartered Accountants. And finally, Phil Richards, head of professional services at Brecker Grossmith Chartered Surveyors. These gentlemen have all agreed to give us their expert opinions and their time, and we are grateful for that. So I think, Michael, you want to kick off, but just a reminder to everyone, if you have questions for any of our speakers today, please feel free to use the Q&A tool in the bottom panel or the chat box. And when the guys have done a roundup on their sectors, they will happily answer as many of your questions as they possibly can in the time allowed. So, Michael, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming for what is our third quarterly panel discussion, loosely round the title of the impact on the property market of COVID. I think this week we have seen some light at the end of the tunnel, or at least it doesn't appear that the train is coming towards us. Hopefully it's the needle coming towards our arms in the near future. I'm very pleased to introduce again Andy Noton. Andy is a partner and a property specialist at Lubbock Fine Accountants, who are based overlooking the dome of St Paul's Cathedral. And Phil Richards, who is in his Wigmore Street office at the moment, is head of professional services, the commercial asset manager and a chartered surveyor. And he has got his own advert behind him, as you cannot see. Anyway, welcome to everybody who's here. The way the afternoon will run is that the three of us will each talk for around 10 minutes on what's been happening since our last panel discussion in September, and may even bravely predict what might happen next year. We've already had a few questions submitted before we started. Everyone is welcome to put in the question and answer part any more questions, and we'll try to get everything answered. So without any further ado, over to you, Andy, and Phil and I will mute ourselves.
Thanks very much, Michael, and welcome to everybody. In the lead up to this talk, I was thinking what was new in the world of tax in accounting since September that I could talk about, and the answer I came up with was not a lot. The autumn budget that we were expecting has been deferred. The spending review did take place, but didn't really say very much in detail about what's going to happen going forwards. And what a change this is to the position we had in June and September when we had these discussions. In June, we had loans, furlough, tax deferrals, business rates holiday. And in September, we were talking about some of the more targeted measures that were addressed by the government, things like SDLT holidays, VAT reductions in the hospitality sector, Eat Out to Help Out schemes. But at the moment, we don't really have much else other than a continuation of these schemes that were there. So I thought I'd talk today a little bit about some recent experiences for our property sector clients and some other clients. Firstly, I'm going to talk about transactions in the investment sector. These haven't dried up at all really in the last 9 months, but each deal that we've been working on has moved forward at a seemingly glacial pace, being on and off countless times and endless changes to prices and terms and conditions. We've seen that prices for assets with good, solid, long income, strong covenants have remained high and increasing. And many clients have been receiving unsolicited offers on these sorts of assets from all types of different investors. Interestingly, sale and leasebacks seem to be back in fashion, with occupiers looking to raise cash. We did just yesterday was discussing with a client and an agent, a client that's got a supermarket car park and loading bay that's let to the supermarket on quite a long lease, 15 years left to run, fixed annual increases, all a pretty good position. A year ago, they tried to engage the tenant on looking to see if they could acquire the rest of the site, re-gear the lease, do something. The tenant wasn't really interested, but in the current climate, that tenant's sort of come back to the table and is quite keen to get something done. So we'll see what sort of happens on those fronts. Last 3 or 4 years, we've had quite a lot of local authorities coming along to buy clients. We don't really act for any local authorities, but we do have a lot of clients that have been selling properties to local authority buyers, and their recent announcement about the public sector works loans could be a bit of an impact that might happen in the future on that, because they've been such a big buyer of properties in recent times. Next, landlords, retail, hospitality clients have been renegotiating leases, payment terms, concessions, and all sorts of creative ways to try and support those tenants, while trying to protect as much value as they possibly can in those assets. Interestingly, some of the early deals that were struck in the pandemic to defer rents and so on are now looking quite optimistic, and a lot of tenants now are sort of getting into the end of sort of rent holidays are coming back to the landlord to say, well, actually, we're still shut down. Can we do something else? I think here turnover rents are going to become more popular. I've seen lots in the press and I've seen 1 or 2 clients engage in these, but these do have their own problems. Office sector, that's all really interesting, mainly because I myself work in a business that uses an office in central London, which is now largely empty and has been for most of the last 9 months. I had a conversation with a valuer a few weeks ago with a client for an audit where they were valuing an office building, a couple of central London office buildings that the client owns, tenants paying their rent, but not really in occupation. And the valuer was telling me that the market yet hasn't really adjusted in terms of rents per square foot for new lettings. They say that rent freeze incentives and so on are going out further for these tenants, but the headline rents have been broadly maintained. I guess what's going to be interesting here is there's a lot of talk from very large occupiers about flexible working practices, closing offices, reducing the amount of space they've got. And the inevitable consequence of that is there's got to be a lot of secondhand space coming to the market over the next 12, 24 months and onwards. And what's that going to do to rents when that space comes on? Countering this, though, there's got to be a decline in the development pipeline for new starts in the last 12 months. Obviously, anything started before that, it's pre-let, it's continuing, but new stuff I think will be much reduced, and possibly an increase in conversions of offices to residential, which we saw a lot of in the last 10 years in the West End market, maintaining rents of office spaces. It all got converted to residential, so we'll see. I think next thing I was going to talk a bit about looking forward to 2021 and what might happen. I mean, Michael indicated we'll talk a little bit about be brave and predict what will happen as the vaccine gets rolled out from next week, we saw. And I think following predictions for 2021, I think we're going to see few immediate tax rises, perhaps some fairly marginal sort of vote pleaser type changes, possibly around things like CGT that are going to affect a relatively small number of people, but not really put much of a dent in a £400 billion deficit that the government's running. I think we'll see potentially some extensions to some of the current reliefs that are out there. I think we'll see the end of furlough, perhaps maybe not in March, but I think we'll certainly see it wound down from then. I think we'll see the business rates holiday is going to be continued in some shape or form, maybe a reduced basis, reduced discounts, or maybe it will just continue to be granted as a holiday. It's interesting to see all the supermarkets in the last 2 or 3 days have been falling over themselves to try and pay it all back. But I think for most retailers, it's been fairly essential cash. SDLT holidays, I think we'll see what might happen on that come March. I mean, the government doesn't like a cliff edge, so we'll see if that gets extended in some shape or form. But I think what we will see in the next 12 months is signposting of where the government is likely to go in the next 10 years. I mean, 10 years ago, we had austerity following the financial crash, and really that was all signposted back in 2010, and we've lived through that up until pretty recently. I think some of the big changes that are going to get signposted will be business rates. I don't think in 5 years' time will exist in the form that it exists today, and that'll get changed fairly significantly. I think we'll see a narrowing of the gap between self-employed and employed taxes, and that's already been muted anyway by the Chancellor back in March when he announced the self-employed income support scheme, and it's been tried before, but I think now the impetus will be there to do something about it. I think we'll see rises to rates for corporation tax, but I don't really think we'll see any big changes to the massive taxes, the ones that really pay for the services, the public services that we all use. The income tax, VAT will stay broadly where it is at the moment. And I think the other element we'll see is limited austerity. So I think the austerity will be limited to things like freezing budgets rather than cutting budgets. Maybe, and we already announced in the spending review freezing public sector pay rises, which over time, of course, saves the government a lot of money, but doesn't actually cost anybody anything in their pocket in nominal terms each year. And lastly, I think I'll talk about interest rates. I think we've got interest rates. They're going to continue to be low for a very long time, just because the sheer amount of debt that's out there. But I do think we'll begin to see a pickup in inflation towards, maybe not next year in 2021, but I would suggest in 2022 and beyond. And I don't think that will be terribly controlled by Western governments as a whole. I don't think this will be a UK phenomenon. I think this will be across Western governments. And I don't think we'll see higher interest rates or tighter fiscal measures to particularly address that. I think that will be used as a way of inflating away some of the current debt positions that we've got, and using that as a method to reduce the deficit. And I think long-term inflation is generally a pretty good thing for the property sector, where you've got fairly regular reviews of rent, because property is a real asset that should appreciate in value. And that's all my sort of long-term prediction is inflation will be the hot topic of the 2020s, whereas it was austerity in the 2010s. And that concludes my piece on the on predictions for next year. So I think next Phil is going to give us his piece. So I'll pass you over to Phil.
Thanks very much, Andy. And it'd be interesting. We should make a few notes and see in about 3 years' time whether any of our predictions,
right or not, or whether we want to lose the recording.
Yeah, exactly. Right, Phil, over to you then. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Andy, for your piece. I'm going to spend a few moments providing an overview of what is happening in the West End office market, and primarily I'm going to focus on the three following key areas: market sentiment, leasing activity, and again my own personal views on what may happen in 2021. At the start of this year, who would have thought that Brexit and COVID-19 could coexist together? And like many sectors of our economy, UK real estate has had to adjust to these difficult and often complex situations. 2020 started with a degree of optimism, and although during the last few months of 2019 there were some reports of a new virus appearing in Wuhan, China, there was no sort of real visible cause for concern in the UK. But how things have changed since then. At that time in January, beginning of January, the property market here in London was gearing itself up for the year ahead, and there was a healthy debate in the press about Brexit and concern from some in the real estate circles about the possible exodus of financial institutions and companies from London to other European cities to reduce the potential impact of Brexit. So what of real estate? Well, in essence, the outlook back then seemed quite positive. West End offices were going okay, companies were paying rent, and the fundamentals of the market seemed to suggest signs of strength. In undertaking some research for this, I was looking at some of the reports from the larger consultancies, and Knight Frank in their report entitled West End Spotlight for the Q3 2019 commented that demand for office space was robust and diverse, and that they had suggested that finance, professional services and corporates were those sectors or businesses which were fairly active in the market, taking space, letting space, and just involved in the day-to-day churn of what was going on. There was also some commentary about the development pipeline, i.e. the supply of new offices. And they mentioned that 62% of all stock back then was already under construction, was already committed, i.e. had pre-lets, or where pre-lets where conversations were taking place. Obviously by March, this whole picture had started to change. And if you skip forward 9 months, the tone of the market is completely different. Although demand for space is still there from occupiers and transactions and activity is still happening, there is a huge amount of uncertainty in the economy at the moment. And as I'm sure you'll all appreciate, uncertainty is bad for business, and that's whichever sector it operates in. Generally speaking, from my perspective, it seems that a vast number of the occupiers that we're talking to at the moment are erring on the side of caution. And I sense they've adopted a wait and see position due to the uncertainty and the double whammy of Brexit and COVID-19 all at once. This picture is reinforced when one looks at the results of the annual Deloitte Crane survey of office construction sites across London. And they comment that 4 out of 5 developers see the weak leasing market as the biggest challenge to development today. And that given these current circumstances, the pressures caused by these external market forces of Brexit and COVID-19, the availability of funding has become a major concern of almost a third of the respondents to their survey, where as development finance becomes scarcer and therefore more expensive, and this is particularly for speculative schemes. So just going on to sort of leasing activity, probably the best word to describe leasing activity at the moment in the West End is muted. And take up in August this year was down to a very extremely low level. The good news is that September saw a slight improvement with around 200,000 square feet leased. But this is well down on the long-term average of about 900,000 square feet. So you can see the market has been hit, the activity has been hit quite hard. Due to the impact of COVID, there are rising numbers of vacancies and low levels of take-up, partly due to reduced levels of business confidence. The Deloitte Crane survey reflects this, and in their research, they comment that a fewer number of development sites are starting to take place on a speculative basis, with the reason being that that there are a large number of sites that are still under construction, which are now already pre-let. So that you can read into that what you may. The research also highlights that the volume of stock under construction remains high due to a significant number of delays caused by the pandemic. And they comment that the completion of over half of the schemes under construction has been delayed by at least one quarter or more, with many completions being shifted to 2021. Now, the implication for that is it has an impact on the cycle of the market and the timing and availability of these big office schemes, and when pre-lets turn from being pre-lets into actually completed lettings. That has an impact for agents' fees, rent flow, landlords getting income, and so on, and the start of rent-free periods. I think at the moment, the overall picture of leasing activity in the West End is very reflective of this. Many of the larger property consultancies are predicting that pre-letting activity will remain robust throughout this year and into next year, as corporates look to review their real estate strategies in order to reduce overheads by restructuring leases and the timing of their relocations. In prime areas of Mayfair and the core West End, I believe that this in time may create upward pressure on Grade A rents as the supply of Grade A space tightens. And whilst this is not necessarily a direct consequence of COVID, it has certainly been exacerbated by it. It must be remembered that this was a feature of the market before the pandemic struck. But I think that the real impact on the West End market will be around the tenant release space. And I feel that this is an area that's expected to grow and may develop into a real negative impact on the market. Again, this was highlighted in the Deloitte Crane survey, where they comment that second-hand availability has surged as businesses increasingly review their real estate footprint and release existing space. And if you're one for statistics, this has translated to a vacancy rate in Q3 this year of 6.1%, which is a little bit above the long-term average of about 6%. So you can see that has a knock-on effect. Another outcome of this is that landlords will be forced to offer a greater incentives to tenants in order to attract them to their properties. If it's a tenant's market because there's lots of space, that the amount of rent, the length of rent-free periods will increase. And in return for committing to a 10-year lease at the moment, it is possible for a tenant to receive a rent-free period in the region to 24 to 27 months. Now, admittedly, that would be on grade A office space, but you can just see the impact that has on landlords, particularly those with high levels of gearing on their properties. To give you an example of what Brecker Grossmith have been doing, we, on behalf of one main client, we've agreed a deal with a tenant to forego their break option, and we've given them 24 months at half rent, just to avoid the risk of a lengthy void. So you can see that has an immediate impact on the landlord. With regards to my own personal views on what may happen next year, whilst I don't profess to own a crystal ball, I have found through my research that many corporates have pushed back their predictions on when a full recovery might happen, with about 2/3 of chief financial officers not expecting business demand to return to a sort of pre-pandemic levels until after Q2 next year, which I think ties in with the comment that Andy was making. This, I believe, could coincide with the positive news of the vaccine this week and the commencement of mass vaccination for the UK population, which could be around Easter time. But we wait to see. I think it would be a real shot in the arm, forgive the pun, if we can get that vaccine as quickly as possible and hope to start giving some businesses more confidence to invest again, and landlords and investors to have more confidence the market's going back in the right direction. I think many companies obviously appear to be struggling with the pandemic and suggesting that the pandemic will have a significant or severe negative impact on their business over the next 12 months. So it might be all well having the vaccine and the signs of a recovery in Q2 next year, but I think the sentiment will continue for a little while longer, is what I sense might happen. And I think faced with the impact of the pandemic and Brexit as well, the stupid bloody word of Brexit, excuse my language, I think companies will continue to look at innovative ways to transform businesses with greater use on the focus of technology and innovation to drive efficiency and obviously therefore productivity, which is important. Just focusing on rental values for a moment and the use of offices, I sense that the concept of the office as an entity won't die, as it will still remain a place where people and business can interact, and where business is done. People are social animals at the end of the day, as we all know. But as we've seen, I think there will be a greater reliance on home working, and whilst an office space in larger towns will remain valid and functional. Let's not forget that investors and landlords will still place a value on property and bricks and mortar, and there will still be an ongoing need to manage leases for people to buy, to sell, and to lease. In terms of where we are now in rents, in the West End at the moment, the prime rents in Mayfair are around about £110 a square foot, which hasn't changed a great deal over the course of this year, primarily because of the tightness of supply of grade A space. And those people who do need to move will end up having to move where necessary. In relation to pre-letting activity, it's unlikely there'll be much change in this, and I think it will remain a feature of the market. But I think that for the immediate future, the supply of grade A space will remain tight, and demand will fluctuate according to business levels of business confidence and activity and growth in the economy. However, finally, just in a way, rounding up, whatever does happen in the next 12 months, there will be highs and lows and further uncertainty. And I think that the real estate will enters the next 12 months with some degree of confidence and hope that the vaccine can help restore business confidence as quickly as possible. because I think from a real estate perspective, that is quite key. Companies investing in people, leases, and so on. But who knows? It remains to be seen. But I think that there'll be a limited period of uncertainty and pain to go before we start to see things turning a corner, one hopes. Finally, to summarise, as I said, we might see a little more pain for the next 1 or 2 quarters, and this may coincide with the arrival of spring and the rollout of a mass vaccination programme. But I think my closing point is that whatever happens, UK real estate is a very important contributor to the UK economy, and this will very much remain. London is still a place where business is done, and it will still remain top of the pile in terms of being a world financial centre. That I don't foresee will change in any sense at all. Values will rise and fall according to demand and the supply, and the UK will continue to attract investors and businesses due to its prominence in the world. And I think this is the point that people forget. We have a stable political and legal system, and I think that will remain fundamental to the success and the continued prominence of the UK and UK real estate. I'd like to now pass on to Michael, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. Very interesting indeed. I'm going to sort of have a brief look from the perspective of my life as a property lawyer. It's interesting. I'm mainly commercial property, but property has never been in the news so much that I can remember for the last few months. We're all still working from home in the main. I try to go in 1 day a week. I know Phil goes in a couple of days and Andy's going back to going in. But it's interesting, Mark Zuckerberg the other day said that he reckons half of his staff will still be working from home in 10 years' time. It's very sad walking through the city where I was earlier in the week. We need the buzz of a vibrant workforce. So I really would encourage everybody who is able to go back to work in the city to try to go in at least 1 or 2 days a week, really to help the local economy, because cafes are closed, bars are closed, restaurants are closed, the retail units are pretty empty. And without the people that the city relies on, it will remain dead. So bit of encouragement there to all of you out there to try and go back in. Couple of points on the economics. Britain's 12 largest property funds say that together they've lost more than £636 million in value since March. It's the growing uncertainty over future demand, and in fact, withdrawals from the funds were suspended for a few months because there was a fear in sort of the earlier part of the pandemic that there really was going to be a run on property funds. And indeed, the Treasury have now banned local authorities from investing in a lot of commercial property funds. And we've all seen in the paper what happened in the London Borough of Croydon. But a bit of good news, there's certainly been an expansion of the technology side, technology businesses in property, even with working from home. Google and Netflix are taking more space, YouTube are taking space in King's Cross, and Apple are taking space in Battersea. And London is now second in the European League of the most attractive property investment and development prospects. Berlin is number 1. So there is some good news on the horizon. On the housing market, there's been good growth, but it's in a way unnatural. There's only 3 months left of the SDLT holiday. I read in a recent RICS survey that buyer inquiries are still rising and should continue for the remainder of the year, and then likely to fall off in spring. Couple of statistics: mortgage approvals in October, fastest rate in more than 13 years. Last month, November, house price rise, highest rate for 6 years, 6.5% year on year in November. There's a lot of pent up demand. There's the SDLT holiday, no SDLT until you spend over £500,000. And people are looking for houses that are suitable for long-term working from home. The downside is that if you do move, you'll find your council tax is likely to rise by the permitted maximum the Chancellor announced of 5%. Now, one of the specialties of my firm is construction, and I also read the Deloitte Crane survey, Phil, and in another survey it said there's a 50% fall in construction in central London and in the city. In the city, 1.2 million pounds worth of development this year, 2.8 last year. So you can see it's really less than half. The interesting thing is the construction business is booming in the suburbs. I know I've got builders here at the moment. I've got a planning permission out for another room. In my small road, there's 4 houses, all the same. And the builders are telling me they think life is wonderful at the moment with everyone working from home, because everybody wants to get more space out of their houses. So the refurbishment seems to be the thing at the moment. It's interesting that some office developers are also refurbishing rather than building. But of course, this could mean that the office supply goes down in the future. But more and more of my clients are looking to downsize. They just don't need the space. They don't need to pay the colossal business rates, and they don't need to be paying for desks that are not occupied. So I've been serving a lot of break notices recently. I'm constantly doing deeds of variation and deeds of surrender and new leases with various permutations of rent. And indeed, after this webinar, I'm actually completing a lease for 12 months where my client's rental is a peppercorn, because the landlords just want him, it's a renewal, to remain in the office building where he is, so they haven't got to pay for empty rates. Rent deposits are being used more to get payments back, and there is still no legal action permitted to recover rent. On the planning front, you may remember last time I talked about the new use class order, and I've got an article on our website. So commercial, business and services now can change within the use class without obtaining local authority planning consent. Permitted development rights for additional stories on houses and flats, demolition of houses and offices for new residential buildings are all predicted. And there was a recent case where an environmental group were challenging the planning regulations. That case was thrown out in the High Court. Now, just looking at some green news, the Green Homes Grant Scheme, this will fund £2 of every £3 spent by a landlord to a maximum of £5,000 to improve the energy efficiency of their properties. And works can include things like wall and loft insulation, draft proofing, double glazing, all works that should improve the energy performance rating of a property. So for those landlord clients, they have been getting on, some of them doing work through the Green Homes Grant. But of course, the main talk at the moment are company voluntary arrangements. And of course, the papers are full of CVAs and assume everyone knows what they mean. I'm going to give you a half-a-minute summary because I get so many people asking me. Basically, if your limited company is insolvent, a CVA can be agreed to pay creditors over a fixed period. So if creditors agree, the limited company can continue trading. It's all run by an insolvency practitioner. They work out the arrangement covering the amount of debt that can be paid and a payment schedule. This must be done within a month of being appointed. and they write to creditors about the arrangement. And as you may have read in today's paper and yesterday's paper, these can be challenged, and Cafe Nero at the moment are having some challenges. And the CVA is approved by is approved if 75% by debt value of the creditors who vote agree. And if the company doesn't meet the agreed payment schedule, any of the creditors can apply to wind up the business. There's been a lot happening today. As Andy mentioned, business rates are being returned. Just before we came on air, I calculated that the 4 supermarkets who so far have said they will return the grants, that's Sainsbury's, Aldi, Morrison's and Tesco, they'll be paying back nearly £14 billion, which in a lot of people's view, they should be doing. So it'd be interesting to see how the government spends it. Unfortunately, again, we've heard of more CVAs in the last couple of days, and Leon, the restaurant chain, they're launching one. But it was interesting, the reason that they're doing it, and I'll quote you, was to cut some of the unsustainable rent, which they believe is a necessity to survive and rebuild. View International, the 3rd largest cinema chain, they have told landlords that they want to be able to defer their rent payments for the next 3 years, or the landlords will just face a CVA. Interesting, the word that they emphasize is they just want to defer the payments, start paying them later next year once there are more films being released, which to me seems a fairly sensible thing to do. In some of these CVAs, though, the landlords can get an upper hand. I was rather impressed that Travelodge recently put their CVA through, but the landlord said, we'll only agree to it if we can have a break clause to take back hotels and hand them over to another operator. And then finally, we've got the decline of the department store. And the 3 of us were talking yesterday when we were running through this, what is going to happen? Because near where I live, we have a huge Debenhams, and next door to it is a huge Arcadia with sort of franchises of all of the Arcadia stores. I gather, just looking at our local website, alternative community use seems to be quite a popular thing, which I think would be a good idea. So we've had a change in the property market. There is still plenty going on. I've still got a number of lettings, a number of re-gearing of leases. I've got a client who is about to do a deal, the usual thing, 3 weeks before Christmas. Michael, it's got to be exchanged before Christmas. That will be fine, won't it? He told me last Thursday, and guess what? I'm still waiting for the deal to be done. Anyway, it's better to be positive. And on that note, that is really all I've got to say about the property side of things. And I'm now going to ask Julie if she could field us some of the questions, please.
Thank you for those roundups. All of those were very interesting. A couple of questions we've got, including someone who's asking about the possibilities for change of use from office to residential. Anyone like to comment on that? Oh, Phil, muted.
I'll jump in there. I think that is certainly a prime question on many people's lips at the moment. It's something that we have looked at in central London for a client that we work for, and I think that the initial dialogue from Westminster was that they would refuse any initial request for change of use from office to residential on the grounds of loss of office space and commercial activity. I think it will be on a case-by-case basis, and probably more pertinent in areas outside of London, in small market towns, rather than in larger urban centres.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else got any thoughts on that?
Well, we are going to be seeing undoubtedly a lot more space on the market, particularly retail space. And I know where I live, which is outside London, The high street, there's still a few vacant units, and there has been a lot of talk as to whether they could be converted into residential or perhaps temporary student or temporary accommodation for homeless people. I think that we have to be creative. The powers that be need to be creative about this and realistic.
Yeah, I'd agree, and I think it's something where in central spaces, there's a lot of talk about people want to move out of the town. They want to move somewhere where they've got more space, and as a result of the last 9 months. But I think as we begin to move back to offices and move back to living in towns and cities, that central London or central locations will be more popular, and office to residential conversions have been pretty successful in the West End in the last 10 years. So I can't see why they won't continue to be so.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Interesting points of view there. Someone else is asking, from a tenant's perspective, how should one approach, or how does one approach a negotiation with a landlord considering or concerning the impact of COVID on their business? Should they automatically have an expectation that the landlord's going to provide assistance, or what sort of concessions should they be asking for?
I'm very happy to jump in there. There's no, I don't, from a landlord's perspective, I think there's no automatic expectation that they will grant a concession. Each individual circumstance is dealt with on a case-by-case basis, and I think that's the only way one can do that. In many cases, landlords have got their own commitments and financial obligations to fulfill and meet, and therefore the rents that are being asked are essential for landlords to cover those payments and meet those obligations. However, it all boils down to a conversation and a dialogue between the parties. And I think if there is an early dialogue and a continued dialogue and a commitment to conduct negotiations in an open and transparent way, then there should be a compromise reached between landlord and tenant. What we don't want to see is tensions and disputes arising over this. I know there's a moratorium on forfeiture, the landlord's right to exercise forfeiture because of non-payment of rent. But I think each tenant needs to review their own circumstances and what they can and can't afford to pay. And it will boil down to a negotiation. And if you put a sensible request into a landlord, one can only ask, is my sense of the way I'd handle that.
Yeah, in fact, Phil, I would agree with you. You may remember we were asked a similar question in our first panel discussion 6 months ago. And I remember saying, if you are a tenant, don't hide under the duvet and hope the landlord will have sympathy, because the landlord won't. But I've spoken to landlord clients almost on a daily basis, and they all tell me the same thing. If they're very happy to communicate. They don't mind a monthly rental, a quarterly. People will repay half in 6 months, as long as there is some sort of agreement. And the important thing is it must be documented. But to have an expectation that the landlord will fall on bended knee to help a tenant, I think is completely unrealistic. But if the parties communicate properly, most landlords are reasonable because they would sooner have their money in some form. And most tenants, if they actually stick their head above the parapet, will find that there are deals to be done.
Okay, so communication and flexibility, they're going to them with a plan of what you can afford, as opposed to just asking for it to stop, maybe a better approach. Okay. The panel's opinion on whether they think the government will extend the SDLT holiday when it's due to expire in March. What are your gut feelings, gentlemen?
Yeah, I'll give some thoughts on that. And I think I mentioned it. I think Michael mentioned it in his talk as well, that it expires on prices up to SDLT on values up to 500,000 in March. It was a strange one when the government introduced it, because the actual housing market wasn't in that much of a difficult state when they introduced it in June. So it was a bit, although it was rumoured, it was a bit unexpected. I think what we'll see is some form of extension, because the cliff edge that it's going to create at the end of March is just going to take all momentum out of the housing market that there is. I think Michael's gave a load of stats in his talk about how we've got record mortgage approvals and record house price increases. I think we'll see the government will extend it. I think maybe they'll tear it down. Maybe they'll say sort of we'll give a 75% discount in sort of April to June, and then 50% and so on, so that you don't get this sort of rush to complete by March, and then a drop off in activity for following that in April that will cause the housing market basically just to grind to a halt. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
No, I think Andy summarised it rather well, actually, realistically.
Agreed. Yeah, agreed.
The final question we've got here that's come in. Someone's talking about asking about calculating turnover rents. They're a landlord, and it's been proposed their company takes a surrender of. They've got a national name retail store, any one of the ones that are currently in trouble. Has asked them to take a surrender of their existing lease and grant them a new lease based on their turnover. In principle, they're saying they're agreeable to this, but how would you suggest calculating turnover rent?
Now, if I can sort of answer that, but it might take a couple of minutes, because turnover rents have come very much back into fashion since, say, the summer. But a lot of people don't really know what they are. It's not quite as recent an innovation as people think, because I remember doing them in the early and mid 1990s. We had one particular client who was taking small units in shopping centres, and we did sort of 60 or 70 of these, and they all had a turnover rent. It's interesting that some of the recent companies who've been taking turnover rents with publicity were as a result of a CVA. New Look, all their 400 stores went from an ordinary commercial rack rent to a turnover basis, and apparently the Crown Estate is now offering them to West End tenants, and Capital and Counties are offering them in Covent Garden. And I think landlords, again, are becoming realistic that after widespread tenant default, they've got to restructure leases. Turnover rents work obviously geared to turnover. It's a fluctuating level of rent, and the mechanism for achieving it has found some market acceptance. There's no magic formula, no statutory formula, but basically the rent is normally a mix of turnover and a base open market value rent. Usually found in retail, leisure, food and beverage, but not unknown, and I think we'll be seeing them elsewhere. Obviously, the attraction from the tenant side is in a poor trading period, there's a degree of downward adjustment, and it incentivizes a landlord, particularly of a shopping centre or a retail park, to keep it well managed and well maintained. And it does mean that a turnover rent is basically promoting the sustainability of the tenant's business so far as a landlord is concerned, reduces the risk of tenant insolvency and rent voids. Now, the calculation is, let me put it this way, I always tell the client, the tenant client, to do a few dummy runs on the calculations before telling me this works, often with their accountant, but it's usually based as a proportion. So you'll have the open market value, and then there will be a percentage of turnover, anything between 1% and 10%. So the lower the base rate, the higher the percentage, and it usually applies to gross turnover. Now, I've seen three methods of calculating them. A straight turnover, where it's base rate plus percentage turnover. A modified turnover, where there's a threshold and the percentage, or a straight threshold turnover. But I'm sure that there are many, many more. There needs to be a periodic reassessment of the base rate element, so regular rent review, far more regular than is seen in most rack rented leases. Turnover rent should be disregarded. The provisions of turnover rent should be disregarded in a rent review clause. And obviously, the alienation clause and change of use will need to be adjusted. You very often find that turnover rent is personal to the tenant only. And the calculation is dead easy because you'll get some digital machine added onto your cash register, like an EPOS machine, electronic point of sale machine. And then there's mail order, internet and telesales, excludes VAT refunds or credits. And you assume there's no deduction for card fees, bad doubtful debt, staff discounts. And then an on-account quarterly payment. The landlord is entitled, or should be, if I'm the landlord's solicitor, I will say, I want to see the figures, say monthly or quarterly, and they can be certified if necessary. And then it normally works, and it normally will work quite well, particularly in a period like now where some shops have had to close or they're on reduced hours, and it will mean the tenant feels happier and at least the landlord knows that there is some money coming in and a tenant who's able to keep going. So hopefully that does answer the question.
Okay, so increasing in popularity and certainly a win-win rather than have an empty.
I think so, yes.
Okay. Gentlemen, that appears to be all of the questions that we have for today. So it just remains for me to thank you for your time. Michael, thank you as always. And to Phil and Andy, thank you again for sparing us the time and giving us your expertise in what can be quite a volatile marketplace at the moment, or certainly lots going on. So always interesting to hear your points of view. So we thank you again for your time. As always, the recording of this will be up and available on our YouTube channel. And early next week, we also hope to be providing or setting the seminar schedule for the first quarter of 2021. So if you'd like any details of that, please don't hesitate to email us, seminars@silverllp.com. The presenters' details will also be on the YouTube, their email addresses. So for Andy and for Phil, you'll be able to contact them, telephone numbers and email addresses and their website details. Gentlemen, thank you very much again.
And thank you, Julie, for facilitating this. We hope that 2021, everybody who's listening, will be less challenging and some return to what life was like before March the 23rd. So it just remains for me, on behalf of the panelists, to thank you all for coming, to wish you, albeit a couple of weeks early, a very happy festive season. Enjoy the break, take care, and we look forward to seeing you again next year, everybody. Thank you very much.
See you again soon. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.